This is Dan Schneider on this Dan Schneider video interview. It's another in my series on the major world religions, and I have two experts on Sikhism, and the conversation will begin in a moment. The subject is the religion of Sikhism. I will be speaking about its origin and its tenets with two experts, Dr. Peshawar Singh and Lou Fennick. Lou is on the left, Peshawar Singh is on the right. Let me just start with Lou. If you could give 2 or 3 minutes background about who you are, how you came to study or practice Sikhism, what draws you to it, etc.
Hey, hello. Thank you very much for the opportunity. Gosh, that's a huge question. And usually when I'm asked that, I defer and say that I was brought up in Toronto. And in the early 1970s, sort of Canadian, maybe the late 1960s, Canadian immigration barriers came down dramatically, and many South Asians, especially South Asians from the Indian state of Punjab, had made their way to Toronto. And when I was a small child, I was very intrigued by these young kids with pieces of cloth over their top knots. And this intrigue never really left me. And fortunately, growing up in Toronto, I grew up in an incredibly rich and vibrant multicultural neighborhood. And these kids were the ones that really stuck out. And so over the years, I'd occasionally heard things about the Sikhs. And then when I joined the University of Toronto as an undergrad, I had the great good fortune of sitting in on a class. I'm not on Sikhism, but rather a class that was titled something like Introduction to the History of the Third World. And there I got my first taste, really, of the Sikhs. There were Sikhs in the class. They had told me stories, and one of the stories I heard, I was so fortunate to hear, was the story of this one Sikh called Baba Deep Singh. And from that moment on, from basically the time I was 19, I've been fascinated by the Sikh tradition.
By the way, was I mispronouncing it? Did it pronounce Sikh? I always thought it was Sikh.
I defer to my colleague and friend Peshawar Singh in that regard.
Okay.
I say Sikh, but so many people say Sikh. Even Sikhs will say Sikh.
Okay.
So I prefer one way, but I don't mind what my students say.
Okay. Peshawar Singh is my second guest. Welcome, Peshawar. And if you could give me just a little bit of background about yourself.
I was born in Punjab, the land of Sikhism, in 1949, and I lived there for about 31 years. I had my master's degree in study of religion with a focus on the Sikh tradition. And then in 1980, I was invited by Sikh Society of Calgary in Canada to work at Guru Nanak Center as a Sikh Granthi, or you can call a Sikh priest. At the same time, I also started taking courses at University of Calgary. So I did my second degree in religious studies, master's degree in religious studies at University of Calgary in 1987. After that, I came to Toronto, University of Toronto, to do my PhD. There I met Lou, and we had a common advisor, Professor W.H. McLeod, who was an international authority on the Sikh tradition at that time. So he was visiting University of Toronto for about 5 years. So we had the opportunity to work with him. So I did my work with him, and I got my PhD in 1991. After that, I was appointed as a visiting assistant professor at University of Michigan, Ann Arbor in 1992. So I worked there for 13 years. And in 2005, I applied for the position at University of California, Riverside. This was an endowed position in Sikh studies. So I was selected, and now I'm holding the chair of Sikh studies. This is called Dr. Jasveer Singh Saini Endowed Chair in Sikh and Punjabi Studies. So for the last 13 years or so, I'm working as a professor of Sikh studies at UCR.
Well, I want to get into the history of Sikhism, but before I do, let's talk about some of the basic tenets, and we'll get into the history as they intertwine. I know that Sikhism is a monotheistic religion. Does the God of Sikhism have any relation to the Allah of Islam, Yahweh of Judaism and Christianity? Is it the same, or is it what is the relation, if any? Either one of you can take that.
You want to go first, my friend?
Well, the God of Sikhism is basically universal God. It includes everyone. In the Sikh scripture, we have all the names coming from the Hindu tradition as well as the Muslim tradition, Allah, Khuda, Sahib, and from the Hindu tradition, Ram, Gopal, Parmeshwar, Paramatma. So Sikhism uses Ek Onkar. God is one, strictly one, without a second, and God is the very life force of this world, and He is fully involved in creation, sustaining us all the time. So God is one, and it's God of all religious traditions in the world.
May I add to that?
Yes.
Thank you. Prashara, that was excellent as always. I'd just like to add that and concur with Prashara Singh in that regard, that the God that the Gurus speak about in the Sikh scripture is everybody's. It's not exclusive to one group. It's not just the God of the Sikhs, but of the Muslims, of the Hindus, of the Christians, of everyone. The teachings of the Gurus are for all of us. And we see this openness, this inclusivity in the very architecture of the Sikhs. When we look, for example, at the premier Sikh Gurdwara, which is a word for Sikh house of worship in which the Guru is housed. When we look at these buildings, it's very purposeful that there are entries on all four sides. This notion of the four directions is very, very common in Indic lore and legend. And by so creating four entrances at all four cardinal directions, the implication that God, as it's understood in the Sikh tradition, is open, is available to everyone, is made absolutely clear.
Let me ask then: is the concept of God in Sikhism, is that sort of like the personal God that Christians talk about, having a personal relationship with it, or is it more of what we might consider here in the U.S. or the Western world, a New Age belief of God being everywhere in all things, a pantheistic God?
Kishore, go ahead.
God in Sikhism is both personal as well as impersonal, transcendent as well as immanent. So God is our father, mother, friend, and beyond gender, And God is, we can establish personal relationship with God because God is not somewhere in the seventh sky or somewhere else. It is right here in our heart, mind, and soul. We can connect with God through the discipline of meditation on the divine name. And through that process, we always feel the presence of God all the time. So we can establish personal relationship with God all the time while sitting, walking, talking. Every time, every moment is basically spent in the presence of God.
I totally concur. That's absolutely correct. I have nothing to add.
Let me just ask then, since from what I've read, Sikhism developed in the 15th century. So this would have been in Punjab. This would have been influenced by Islam, influenced by Hinduism, and even Buddhism is not far off. How does Sikhism differ from those three major religions, putting aside Christianity or Judaism?
May I just begin this one, my friend? Thanks. That's a good question. You say it begins in the 15th century, and to a certain extent, you are right. Guru Nanak's formative years, Guru Nanak was born in 1469, and his formative years were in this century. But Sikhism flowers, or it begins to flower, at the beginning of the 16th century. Now, usually when I speak to my students about influences, to get to your question immediately, because the vast majority of my students are Christians with occasional Jews and some Muslims thrown in, I try and give them an analogy with which that they can understand, And I tell them that the relationship between Sikhism and the other traditions to which you made reference are somewhat similar, at least in regard to historical trajectories, are somewhat similar to the relationship that exists between Christianity, Judaism, and their contemporary Near Eastern traditions. Now, they emerge out of a sort of the dialogue that's emerging between those religious traditions within their respective 15th century environments. But as a result of the unique charismatic personality of Guru Nanak takes those ideas and he refracts them through the lens of his own dynamic personality. So although Christianity emerges out of the Judaic tradition, nevertheless, as a result of its specific historical trajectory and the uniqueness of its founders, its savants, its interpreters, it becomes something altogether unto itself, something unique. No one today would claim, for example, that Christianity is a sect of Judaism. Right? And so too, no one should claim that Sikhism is a sect of any of these traditions. Now, to circle back to the point about influences, we certainly see affinities. There certainly are affinities between Sikhism and the traditions to which you made reference. As my colleague Peshora has just said, for example, the Sikh tradition begins in many ways. The very first page of the scripture has the ligature, Ikonkar, God is one. Okay? And this has an affinity with Islam. But simultaneously, the Sikh gurus also speak about karma. They also speak about reincarnation. And here we find an affinity with more Hindu traditions within the 15th century environment. So to speak about influences, I'm a little uncomfortable about that. I like to see things as the product of Guru Nanak, taking this legacy, inheriting it, and adapting it in the light of his own experience of the world. That's my answer.
By the way, Lou, before I go into Peshawar, are you a practicing Sikh yourself?
No, I'm not.
Okay.
No. Practicing Sikh, yes.
Yes. Go ahead, Peshawar.
Yes. Guru Nanak was certainly the product of his own times. He entered into dialogues with Sufis, Muslim saints, into Hindu scholars, Brahmins, and he entered into dialogue with Nath yogis, practitioners of yoga tradition at that time. And these were the main spiritual leaders with which he had dialogues, and those dialogues are recorded in the Guru Granth Sahib, Siddh Gostis, for example, dialogue with the Nath yogis. And then there are a number of verses where he is addressing the Muslim tradition, Islamic ideals in his own way, And Guru Nanak basically, was very well learned in the Hindu tradition, even in the Vedic tradition. There are references to of his knowledge about the Vedas and Upanishads and so on. But in his own way, he's expressing his ideas in the light of his own personal experience. He had that enlightenment experience at the age of 30, when he suddenly, he used to go to a river for bathing early in the morning, But that day he disappeared for 3 days. And then he emerged from the waters and made the statement, there is no Hindu, there is no Muslim. Because these were the two traditions at that time. He's making the statement that we should look beyond these labels and look at the common humanity. So basically, Guru Nanak is trying to interpret the Sikh traditions in the light of his own experience, and he became the founder of a new religious tradition emerging in the pluralistic environment of North India at that time. And he is basically in dialogue with all religious traditions because he traveled for 2 decades. He went from pilgrimage center to another pilgrimage center, and during those travels, he came into contact with those spiritual leaders and he tested the veracity of his own ideas, and he was able to offer a very systematic, coherent pattern of his teachings in the light of his own experience of travel, his enlightenment experience, and then he presented a Sikh teachings. Lewis writes, that karma and reincarnation are common to all religious traditions originating in India: Jain tradition, Buddhist tradition, Hindu tradition, Sikh tradition. But Guru Nanak defines karma in a very new way. It's not the same understanding of karma in Sikhism as it is in all other religious traditions. So for Guru Nanak, grace is the primary source. It can break millions of karma in a second. So Sikhism is basically a religion of grace, and it lays emphasis on good actions, hard labor, responsible living in the society, raising up the family, but at the same time, remembering the divine all the time. So divine name teachings, remember the divine name all the time, earn the living through honest means, and share the fruit of earnings with others. This sums up his teachings.
Let me ask.
Yeah,
Go ahead.
No, I just wanted to say that's exactly right. And this, as Peshora has so often said, is this emphasis on ethical behavior we see in Guru Nanak really sets him apart from so many of those, right, who were articulating somewhat similar doctrines in the 15th and the 16th centuries. There is perhaps no what's the right word? No religious figure in India at the time of Guru Nanak who is emphasizing the dignity of honest labor, right? The dignity. It's not enough to live. It's not enough to speak about the truth. One has to live it in one's being. One has to live it in oneself. And you do that not just through serving God, you do it through serving everybody, through serving humanity. And we see this today consistently. If you look in South India today, the devastating floods that are going through the Indian state of Kerala, who are the first people to respond to these? It's Sikhs. Sikhs organize, they go down to these flood-ravaged areas, and they're doing everything they can in order to alleviate the suffering of these people, to serve humanity in consonance with the message of Guru Nanak, which once again underscores this extraordinary ethical dimension that we don't generally see in the teachings of other saints, for lack of a better word right now, of the 15th and the 16th centuries.
Let me ask a little bit about the structure of Sikh hierarchy, if you will. Obviously, Roman Catholics have the Pope. There's the Dalai Lama in Buddhism. Christianity has split into Eastern Orthodox, Catholicism, Protestantism, and then into further sects. You've had Sufi, Shia, Sunni Muslims. Is there any splitting of doctrine that or is there just one Sikh religion?
Peshawar, my friend, please.
That's a very interesting question. Well, although there's no priesthood in Sikh tradition, there's no hierarchy as you have in the Catholic tradition, because the 10th Guru, during the time of Guru Nanak's, Guru Nanak was the authority figure. And then he was succeeded by 9 Gurus. And the notion of Guru is very unique in the Sikh tradition, because Guru is a enlightener who teaches, who offers the guidance. And Guru Nanak appointed his successor, and he became the Guru. Guru Angad is the second one. Then Guru Amardas, third one. Guru Ramdas, fourth one. Guru Arjan is the 5th Guru who compiled the Sikh scripture and created an independent structure for the Sikh tradition. And Guru Hargobind introduced, the combination of spiritual and temporal dimensions of Sikh life. And then Guru Har Rai, Guru Har Krishan, and Guru Tegh Bahadur was the 9th Guru who was executed. Guru Arjan was also martyred by Emperor Jahangir, and second Guru, 9th Guru Tegh Bahadur was executed by Emperor Aurangzeb, and he was succeeded by his son Guru Gobind Singh, the 10th and the final Guru. Guru Gobind Singh created the order of the Khalsa, as you see, the outward form of the Sikhs, and we will go into that later on. And Guru Gobind Singh then, before his death, he terminated the line of personal Gurus and declared that now onwards, the authority of the Guru will stay with the Sikh scripture and the community as a whole. So we have a twin doctrine of authority within the Sikh tradition. It is the Guru Granth Sahib, the scriptural authority, and community as a whole as a collective sort of authority.
Okay.
So there's no hierarchy within the community.
Okay. Let me ask about the symbol that I see of Sikhism. When you Google Sikhism, you have the Christian cross, you have the sickle, the crescent moon for Islam. And there's an interesting figure for Sikhism. It looks in one way almost like a death's head, a skull, but also it could also be plowshares coming up. Is that an official symbol of Sikhism? And what is it called?
Me, you?
Either one.
Me? Okay. That symbol to which there are actually 2 symbols that are very, very common. You certainly have referenced one. And that symbol is called the khanda. And the khanda is composed of a number of components. You'll notice, for example, that there is a circular element to it.
Yeah.
And that circular element is a chakra, a quoit, a sort of throwing discus, okay? And it symbolizes the divine because, it's circular, God has no beginning and no end, and weapons play a very important role within the imaginary of the 10th Sikh Guru, and by extension, therefore, the Khalsa. And it's flanked by 2 swords. You'll notice those 2 swords, it's flanked.
Yeah.
If you look closely, it sort of looks like the middle of the Iranian flag, but that's just by coincidence. Those 2 swords represent a doctrine, a binary that permeates much of Sikh tradition, a binary that can be summed up in many ways: sweetness and strength, for example, spirituality and a secular dimension. In Sikh tradition, we generally refer to it as miri piri. Miri, the word mir, it means something like gentleman. So miri could be translated, although rather awkwardly, as gentlemanliness. This is a commitment to engage in the world itself, rather than simply to ignore the world and thus shun your responsibilities within the world. And piri, the word pir is actually originally Persian, as far as I know, though it could be Turkish. Persian, and it references a Sufi master. Piri means spirituality. Okay, so what one is meant to combine is the spirituality of the saint and the strength of the soldier. And this means it's in many ways an extension of Guru Nanak's doctrine of living in the world, but not succumbing to the temptations the world offers. That is to say, temptations to view the world as truth, to rise above these temptations. So that's what the khanda generally tends to represent. The other symbol about which I was speaking is basically the Ik-Onkar. You may recall that word has been repeated 3 times in this broadcast so far. Ik-Onkar is a ligature which combines the first number that Punjabi is generally written in, and is the script that's written in, and the first letter. So it's sort of the equivalent of 1A. And this is a sign of the unicity of God, or the unicity of the divine. Kishore, I'm sure I've left a lot out, so please, would you elaborate on the khanda?
Well, khanda, this is called Khalsa insignia. At the center is the double-edged sword. It represents the divine power, God of justice and God of mercy. So 2 edges of that khanda represent divine grace and divine justice. And circle represents the entire universe. At the center of the universe is one divine power, the khanda. And it's surrounded by 2 swords, sword of Miri and sword of Piri, spiritual sword and temporal sword. So there's a sort of balance between the 2 realms of life, secular and spiritual. There's basically no contradiction between church and state or religion and politics. In Sikhism, these 2 things are combined, interconnected. Religion and politics go hand in hand. Spiritual life and temporal life go hand in hand. We have to live in this world. We cannot divorce ourselves from what's happening on the ground. We have to participate in temporal affairs, knowing that this is divinely inspired, seeking guidance from our spirituality. Spiritual experience and worldly life should go hand in hand. So this is a symmetrical symbol. If you look at the khanda, it's a symmetrical structure. It balances. If you remove one sword, there will be imbalance. In order to achieve balance in life, you have to participate in the worldly life, because this world is divinely inspired, and deeds done in this world are, helping us to progress in our spirituality.
Let me just. Go ahead.
Sorry, no, I said I would completely concur with that. That was beautifully said. And since I earlier made a reference to Sikh shrines and Gurdwara or Gurdware, let me once again refer you to the very complex of the Golden Temple, where that idea of balance is manifest, is instantiated into the very morphology of the temple. You have, for example, in the center of the pool of water, the Sarovar, you have in the very center the Prakashastan, the place of spirituality, where the Guru Granth Sahib is housed. And then right across from it, across the bridge, right? There we go. Thank you, Pashara. Right across the bridge, you have something that Sikhs generally refer to as the Akal Takht, the throne of the immortal one, or the throne of God. And on the throne of God is representative of that secular dimension to which Pashara Singh was making reference.
I wanted to ask about some specific things I'm looking here online about prohibitions. A friend of mine who's Christian once told me that he thinks one of the worst things in Christianity was the 10 Commandments, which were bad things, rather than Jesus' Sermon on the Mount, which said how to be a good person, and that Christianity went wrong by not following the things that Jesus said to do good rather than what not to do. But I'm looking here. It says there seem to be 5 major prohibitions against cutting hair, intoxication, a priestly class, eating meat, and adultery. Uh, are those things considered like the 5 commandments of Sikhism? Is it an equivalence?
Please, Peshora, this is your question.
Well, this is called Code of the Khalsa, Code of Conduct of the Khalsa. So these are the 4 prohibitions. To cut the hair for an initiated Khalsa Sikh is a sin. And to second one is, to
Intoxication?
to eat halal meat, the meat, the animal is cut slowly. The animal is cut with one blow. That meat is acceptable. But when it is cut slowly by torturing the animal, that is not acceptable. But this is basically, coming from a reaction towards what's happening in Islamic tradition at that time. So halal meat is prohibited, and adultery is prohibited. You cannot commit adultery. You cannot have any kind of extramarital relationship. So you cannot also use tobacco in any form. It is strictly prohibited. So these are the 4 commandments for the Khalsa Sikh. Most of the Sikhs, they don't smoke.
Mm-hmm.
You will not find a Sikh using smoking or using tobacco in any form.
How about any other drugs or any
No
hallucinogens?
drugs. Everything is prohibited.
Okay. And is there, if someone was found to well, let me just ask, so I would assume polygamy is banned too. You can only marry one woman.
Yes.
So if someone, let's say, was found doing some kind of drugs, or someone took photographs of a Sikh cheating on his wife, would they be banned from Sikhism? Are they excommunicated?
Go ahead, Peshora.
I'm sorry. I'm just asking. I'm just asking.
All kinds of people are there in every religious tradition.
Yeah.
But, any Khalsa Sikh, who commits any one of those 4 things, he's automatically becomes an apostate.
Uh-huh.
He's not excommunicated in the sense, that he's completely out of the tradition, but he has lost his status of the Khalsa tradition, and he can be reinitiated. He will appear before the 5 beloved ones in the congregation, and then they will punish him, offer him penance, and he can be reinitiated and he can mend his ways. Mm-hmm. So those are strict injunctions for the Khalsa Sikhs.
And what is the rationale for that? Is that because this prohibits someone from spiritual growth if they're an adulterer or a drug user?
Yes. If you commit any one of these 4 prohibitions, you fall from the grace. Uh-huh. You fall from spirituality. You are not leading a spiritual life at all.
And
you fall from the ideal.
And since we live in the 21st century, I have to ask, what is the Sikh view on homosexuality or bisexuality, things like that?
That's a good question.
Uh-huh.
And from what I know, the response I can give you is that, well, first, Sikhs are human beings. And so it depends on whom you ask. As far as I know, and of course Peshora Singh will correct me on this, there is no official position in regard to those things. There are Sikhs I know, for example, who belong to the LGBTQ community. And what they emphasize when I speak to them is that Guru Nanak spoke about love, right? And in this way, there is room for them to proudly belong to the Sikh tradition. But then there are other Sikhs who hold differing opinions. So this is still an ongoing process. There, again, just with these concerns in other religious traditions, there are as many answers to that question in many ways as there are people within the tradition. It's really difficult to pin one group down, to pin that to pin one answer down is what I meant to say.
Peshawar,
But of course, I would defer to my colleague Peshawar Singh in this regard.
Well, the official position within the Sikh tradition is basically, that you cannot perform the marriage of homosexuals or lesbians and LGBTs in the Gurdwara. So that's not acceptable. So there is a sort of reaction against it in UK, in Canada. There are some voices now trying to make the case, but officially it's not acceptable. Because Guru Nanak said, you have to live the life of the household. And it's meant for procreation. And the marriage is between a man and a woman. So that is what Guru Nanak stressed, So you do not find any reference about homosexuality in the Sikh scripture. These are the modern issues that we are dealing with.
Well, let me ask then about, we mentioned the Punjab was where it developed, and that's in northwest India. How about traditional crimes, murder, rape, thievery, etc.? Is there an equivalent of Sharia law? Is there a Sikh law? Is in the Punjab or areas where Sikhs have gained political ascendancy, do they have a secular divide between that? There's the criminal, or there's the political law, and there's the Sikh sin, if you will. Either one of you.
Go ahead, my friend.
Well, yes, the Sikh, basically they condemn all kinds of actions, like homosexuality, like rape and murdering of the aborting a female fetus. That's officially, the Sikh tradition has said, anyone who does that is not a Sikh. So there are injunctions against those persons, who are committing these crimes. But of course, political process is there to take care of them. But officially, the Sikh gurus were against the killing of a female child. And any Khalsa Sikh who's dealing with them, he has to be abandoned by the community. So that's a positive response towards female feticide.
Infanticide. Yeah.
Infanticide. Right. So that's a very strict injunction. And then against rape and all, again, Guru Nanak was very deadly against the rape, when Babur's army attacked India in 1521 and 1526. He witnessed the Mughal soldiers, raping Hindu women, Muslim women, and he was pained to see those rapes, And he has written 4 compositions in the Guru Granth Sahib called Babur Bani, utterances concerning the Babur's invasion. So Guru Nanak was condemning those actions. And a rape is regarded as a loss of family status, loss of social standing in the community. So it's strictly condemned by the Sikh gurus.
Well, let me ask this in that vein. We've just mentioned females. What place do women have in Sikhism? In the Sikh tradition, or do women have to walk 3 paces behind the men? And also, since it developed within the subcontinent, what is the Sikh view on the traditional caste system? So females and caste system.
May I go first?
Go ahead. Yeah.
Okay, thanks. That's a great question. And what I'm going to do is answer it by reference to how most Sikhs would answer. Now, there are 2 questions there, of course. One is in regard to women, the other is in regard to caste. Guru Nanak, at least one of my colleagues thinks of Guru Nanak as probably one of the earliest feminists, not just in India, but in the world. Because there is a very specific hymn where Guru Nanak says, what is it with these people who criticize women and degrade women? We're all born of women, right? We're all born of women, and so women are the mothers of kings, of everybody. So by condemning them, you're condemning all of us, or belittling all of us. Guru Nanak does something which which is very empowering. And he looks at things such as, or he talks about things, and again, Kishore, I may need your help here because, again, I'm working impromptu. He looks at something like menstrual flow, right? I think in the Guru Granth Sahib it's Sutak, right?
Yes.
Sutak. And he looks at this, and this is traditionally considered so polluting that when women are going through their monthly periods, they are, in certain instances, not even allowed to attend certain religious functions. And Guru Nanak comes out and says things like, you guys who condemn this, you're such hypocrites because all life begins in this quote-unquote pollution. And so if this is pollution, then everybody is polluted, right? So he's very empowering in this way. Now, of course, these are the words of the Guru. And in many ways, the Guru was close to perfect, right? And this is only a perfection to which we can aspire, right? As disciples of the Guru, right? As disciples of these teachings that have been given to all of us. Now, in modern day life, sometimes it's difficult to apply those teachings every day. And so you will see discrimination. It breaks my heart to say it, but you do see discrimination against women in certain places in India, despite the very progressive teachings of the Sikh gurus. Okay? Now that's what I have to say about women. But in regard to caste, it's very, very clear. Condemnations of caste resound throughout the Guru Granth Sahib. They're everywhere. I mean, I don't think they're on every page, but they're probably close to on every page. So caste, especially the discriminatory aspects of caste, are outrightly condemned. Caste, the Gurus repeatedly say, has no position in determining one's afterlife, right? Caste does not matter. All people are equal in this regard, okay? Now, there are certain aspects of caste, particularly aspects dealing with marriage, that were not wholeheartedly condemned because these were not generally as discriminatory as other elements of caste, which saw, for example, a system where the higher ups were determined to subjugate those below them. That's what the Gurus condemned. But generally, when it came to marriage rules, for lack of a better way of explaining it, these were not outwardly condemned by the Sikh Gurus. Okay? So I hope those two answers, which thankfully Kishore Singh is here to supplement, are satisfactory.
Peshawar, if you want to say something.
Well, I would begin with Guru Nanak's passage, scriptural passage on women. Let me read it, clearly. From woman born, shaped in the womb, to woman betrothed and wed, we are bound to woman by ties of affection. On woman, man's future depends. If one woman dies, he seeks another. With a woman, he orders his life. Why then should one speak evil of women, they who gave birth to kings? Women also are born from women. None takes birth except from a woman. Only the true one, Akal Purukh, God, Nanak, needs no help from a woman. Blessed are they, both men and women, who endlessly praise the Lord. Blessed are they in the true one's court. There shall their faces shine. So this is the exact reference of Guru Nanak, where he condemns his contemporaries, who are condemning women for their menstruating cycle and so on. So he is basically raising voice of protest against the contemporary religious leaders who are condemning women. He said, no, women are equal with men in all respects. Basically, he number of times he uses woman's voice and he speaks as a woman. A number of hymns, are recorded in the voice of woman. So Guru Nanak basically was a revolutionary at that time, and his successors, Guru Amar Das, he created complete equality between men and women. He appointed women as missionaries. He also abolished the customs of veil, parda, and sati, immolation, on the funeral pyre of their husband. If the husband dies, woman has to die along with the husband. So he abolished these customs. Basically, Sikh doctrine offers equal treatment to women. Men and women are equal in all respects. So that's a Sikh doctrine. In practical aspects, women are still, lagging behind in terms of leadership roles in the Sikh community, in the Gurdwara committees and so on. So we have still a long way to go, but there is a doctrinal equality assigned to women in all aspects of life.
Well, let me. I want to ask a couple of questions specific to some ideas about Sikhism, and then I'll let you, if I missed any major points you want to make, and then we'll switch over to the more historical, cultural aspects of Sikhism. The first I wanted to talk about was was just looking up here that is it true that the Sikh idea is that the universe is somehow not the realist reality there is? That there's a deeper, more fundamental reality, that this is an illusion? Lou, you're laughing. Go ahead.
Now, that is a point of view against which the Gurus certainly spoke. The world is not illusion. The world, as a creation of God, is real. And this is where Guru Nanak's emphasis on ethical behavior really shines through and really demonstrates his uniqueness amongst his contemporaries. Many, the word we use is bhagat. Many bhagats or sants. These are exemplars, teachers, especially of the Hindu tradition. Many of these spoke about this issue of Maya. Maya being the cosmic delusion which masks, tricks us into thinking that all there is the world. But it's not delusion in the traditional Hindu sense, or the more orthodox Hindu sense, I beg your pardon. The world is real. And because it is real, because God created the world, it is real. And thus, because it's real, and because we follow the doctrines of the Gurus, we have a moral responsibility, right, to serve everyone, to, make sure that the divine order is maintained through our selfless service. And by this, by such service, and by meditating on the divine name, in this way, we are near assured the grace of God. And that grace is essential to securing the knowledge that leads to liberation from the cycle of existence. So the world is very much real from the Sikh perspective.
Peshawar?
Yeah, the world is basically real, but it's ever-changing, evolving. So for Guru Nanak, this world is wonderful. So to live life in this world is a great privilege. Human birth is a rarest diamond given to a human being, So he should use every breath very, wisely. So we should not waste away this life. So life in this world is real, and that's why, Guru Nanak's emphasis on the glory of creation, the beauty of the world, the trees and everything. If you read his composition, you will be amazed how he, enjoys with awe and wonder, the beauty of creation. The world is beautiful, its truth, its reality. It's not illusion.
No.
So because his contemporaries were putting emphasis, this world is illusion, withdraw from this world. So they laid emphasis on asceticism. Guru Nanak rejects asceticism completely. So you have not to renounce the world. You have to live in this world, earn your living through honest means, and share the fruit of earnings with others. So if you don't live in this world, if you think this world is delusion or illusion, you will not be able to earn your living. You will start begging, as other traditions put emphasis on begging. Guru Nanak says no begging.
And indeed, the entire world participates in the glory and the veneration of God.
Right.
There's so many beautiful hymns that liken the natural process of the sun rising, for example, to rituals of entertaining and celebrating the divine. The sun is the lamp that's waved, very much like a ritual in the Hindu tradition called arti. So everything participates in the glory of God, the whole nature of the world. And this too underscores this idea that the world is real.
Peshawar, I want to ask my next question to you to start out with. In the three major Western religions, Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, there's a sort of paradox in that the belief is that God, Yahweh, Allah, is all-knowing, yet mankind has free will. And that's a philosophical paradox. In the Sikh tradition, are human beings free agents? Do they have agency? Can they choose to be this, that, or the other thing? Peshawar?
Human beings are given free agency, they enjoy free will, but they have to basically accord with the divine will. That divine will is written within our life, within ourselves. Guru Nanak says right in the beginning, there's a question raised by Guru Nanak, how truth is to be attained and how the veil of falsehood torn aside. Then he answers, Nanak, thus it is written, follow the divine order, walk in its ways. So Guru Nanak is saying that you basically align your free will with the divine will. Once you submit your ego, once you transcend your self-centeredness, you will basically follow the divine will, and that divine will becomes your will. So you have the freedom of will to do anything.
Okay.
You are responsible for your actions.
Lou, do you have a point on that?
Oh, yeah, I perfectly agree with that. That was Japji Sahib, I think.
Yeah, that's right.
But yeah, it's absolutely, you attune yourself to, Guru Nanak speaks of something which we also hear in the rhetoric and the language of yoga. And that is, and Peshawar, correct me if I'm wrong here, the Unhad Shabd. The Unhad Shabd, the mystical word spoken throughout creation. And our goal is to attune ourselves, to attune our entire being to that particular word. And of course, human beings in this regard are individual agents. But at the same time, it's very clear that through their own agency, human beings can never achieve liberation. The creedal statement of the Sikh tradition, which is found on the very first page of the Sikh scripture and repeated throughout the Guru Granth Sahib, is that we know this through the grace of the Guru. That grace must be granted in order for us to achieve liberation. We always need God's help, even though we are our own independent agents.
Well, I want to move on to some historical aspects and cultural aspects, but before I do, have I missed any major points? Is there any major point in the theology or the structure of Sikhism that you feel is important that I've missed before we move on?
I can only say, Lou has mentioned briefly, for Guru Nanak, the attainment truth is the final goal. truth is the supreme virtue, but higher still is truthful living. And the emphasis is on truthful living. And truthful living means, you have to think truly, you have to speak truly, you have to act on the truth. So there has to be an agreement between our thoughts, words, and deeds. And truthful living is basically the heart of Sikh religion, Sikh way of life. And that is the goal. Of course, truth is a supreme virtue, but if no one is practicing truth, what is the use of that virtue? So you have to put that into practice. You have to firmly commit yourself to attain truth, and for that purpose, we have to rise above self-centeredness, ego, home. I am something, I-ness, my-ness, always talking about ourselves. We come to personal gratification. So Guru Nanak's main aim was to rise above ego, above home, self-centeredness. And once you rise above that, then you are able to achieve liberation from suffering, from evil, from everything. And that's the goal of life, to rise above home. And the divine word, unspoken speech, that Lou mentioned, is always residing in your heart, mind, and soul. Basically, you have to stop the chatter of your mind. We are always talking, we are always thinking, and we are not, at one moment, we are not still, we are not listening to that voice. That voice is there. Once we stop our chattering, once we stop our speech, then we listen to that unspoken sound, anhad shabad, unspoken word, that is in our self, heart, mind, and soul.
Lou, do you have anything to add?
No, that was perfectly said. He's absolutely right. That is exactly what I take from Guru Nanak's teachings, to attune oneself to the divine vibration, to put it away some of my Sikh friends' state.
Mentioned Guru Nanak before, and since he's sort of the founder, is he sort of the equivalent of the Buddha within that tradition? Is he revered above all other gurus?
That's a really interesting question. I'm going to answer a part of it, and then I'm going to let my friend Peshora answer it. That's a great question, because when you ask that question, I can say yes and I can say no simultaneously. Of course, all 10 gurus are equal. When I was young and I was just beginning to become very serious about studying the Sikh tradition, I had the honor of being invited to one of the many, many Sikh camps that were given around Toronto. They were camps you would go, sleep in a tent or a cabin, and young Sikhs would learn about their tradition. So once I had asked a group of young children, who is your favorite guru?
We're back with Lou Fennick and Peshawar Singh. Hopefully we've got Lou's audio issue straightened out. Before we had that, we were talking a little bit about the role of Guru Nanak. And let me just go to Peshawar here. If you want to pick up where Lou had been going about Guru Nanak, is he the primate, the top banana?
He's the founder of the Sikh tradition, there's no doubt about it. So he enjoys the supreme position, because other gurus basically use his name in their writings to show continuity with the founder of the tradition. And all the successors are equal with the founder, equal in all aspects. So they enjoy the same status and honor given to Guru Nanak and Guru Gobind Singh, up to Guru Gobind Singh. All the 10 gurus enjoy the same status and honor within the Sikh community. Like all other founders of different traditions, Buddha is the Buddhist tradition, for Buddhist tradition, Jesus for the Christianity, and Moses for Judaism, and Muhammad for Islam. So similarly, Guru Nanak is basically the starting point, the founder of the Sikh tradition.
So I know, just looking up, that there was persecution by the Mughal Empire, and that was basically an Islamic leadership. How did this transform the Sikhs? Did they, because just in scanning briefly the history, there seems to have been I guess I don't know what to say, a sect or a caste or a group that became warrior Sikhs. Are they sort of protectors of the faith? Lou?
Well, that's a really good question. Are they protectors of the faith? You know, let me use an analogy that emerged in the early 17th century. And in one of these analogies, in this analogy, one of the great savants of the Sikh tradition, a cousin of the third guru, named Gurdas Palla, Gurdas said that certain Sikhs became more martial to protect the others in the same way that thorny trees surround a garden to protect the interior of that garden. They're a part of the garden, they're different, but they're still part of that particular community. So that likely arose because of the persecution that the Sikhs were suffering in the early 16th century. Right? And that was further enhanced, as Peshawar Singh just mentioned. The ninth Guru was executed by the Mughal emperor, or under the orders of the Mughal emperor Aurangzeb. And it's likely that that execution played a role in the creation of the Sikh community to which Peshawar Singh gave voice a moment ago, that is the Khalsa. That would be my take on it. But again, I refer you to Peshawar Singh.
Yes. Basically, you know, if you look at the historical context of the evolution of the Sikh community, then Guru Nanak and Babur go hand in hand historically, you know. In 1526, Babur established a Mughal rule in India after conquering, you know, Ibrahim Lodi, and then he established a Mughal rule. His successor, Humayun, was defeated by Sher Shah Suri, and then Akbar became the ruler of Mughal Empire. Akbar was the most liberal and tolerant Mughal emperor. And during his rule, Sikh tradition evolved peacefully and progressed to a great extent. The moment Emperor Akbar died in 1605, within 8 months of his death, his son and successor Jahangir executed the fifth Guru Arjan on 30th May 1606. So that was a complete shock to the Sikh community. They were put into a position where the leader is taken away, and his successor, Guru Hargobind, he, you know, wore two swords, sword of Miri and Piri, in order to introduce the militancy within the Sikh tradition, that we are now going to defend our tradition from persecution. From that historical period onward, the Sikh community was always under pressure from the Mughal persecution. And ninth Guru was executed. As a response, Guru Gobind Singh created the order of the Khalsa. And that order of the Khalsa is the order of warrior saints who are ready to defend the faith and fight against injustice and tyranny. So Khalsa, basically the ethical duty of the Khalsa is to stand for truth and justice all the time. Whenever there is any kind of injustice, any persecution, the Sikhs will defend and they will rise against that tyrannical rule. So that's how persecution has basically pushed the Sikh tradition towards militancy. Originally, you know, Guru Nanak, of course, Guru Nanak was also very vociferous. You know, he raised a strong voice against Emperor Babur, you know. But by the time of the fifth Guru, when Guru Arjan was executed, you have a situation where Sikhs have to survive.
Peshawar, it was mentioned earlier how after the 10 gurus, I guess the guru dumb or whatever became instantiated within the actual scripture.
Yeah.
So is this sort of like when we talked about the circle and its import? Is this sort of like an Ouroboros that the snake is eating its own tail? That everyone is now equal? Is Sikhism a leaderless religion?
Yes, basically, when Guru Gobind Singh gave authority to the community as a collective entity, that there will be no single person who will be Guru anymore. So the community Panth will be the Guru Panth, the community as an authority figure. So in that kind of concept, you have all Sikhs are equal in all respects. So there's no hierarchy at all. All the Khalsa Sikhs are equal in all respects. But the Khalsa tradition is only, it's not all Sikhism. There are only, at this moment, 20% of the Sikh community will be the Khalsa community who are initiated. Another 60 to 7% will be affiliated with the Khalsa. They will not be fully initiated, but they will be following the tradition, wearing the turban, keeping the hair uncut, and so on. So there are 10% and so who have cut their hair. Now the trend in the Western countries is, majority of the Sikhs have cut their hair. So they have assimilated in the Western culture. So we have different kinds of ways of being Sikh. Initiate Khalsa Sikhs, have turban bearing Kestari Sikhs who wear the turban and hair, and you have Bona Sikhs who have cut their hair, and you have Sahitari Sikhs slowly who are following the teaching. And then you have apostates who, after being initiated, they have committed one of the four prohibitions.
Okay. Well, let me just. I think you're fading in now a little bit. I don't know if it's due to Lou's feed, but let me ask Lou about, and we'll wrap this up in the next 5 or 10 minutes. What was the Sikh relationship to the British Empire during the British Empire's rule over India, and how did partition and the post World War II creation of India and Pakistan, how did that affect the Sikhs?
Wow, that's a huge question. Do you have a semester? I mean, it's huge. Let's try and put it in perspective.
Peshawar, can you just sort of, I guess, sum up if you can in a couple of minutes? I know it might take a semester, but were the Sikhs a favored group within the British Empire's dominion over India, or were they even more persecuted by the British than they were by their ancestral neighbors?
Well, it's a very interesting question. After the creation of the Khalsa by Guru Gobind Singh in 1669, and he died in 1708, the 18th century, basically, Sikhs were fighting against the Mughal forces and Afghan invaders. So during that century, they were able to establish their own rule in Punjab. In 1765, they took the control of Lahore. In 1779, Maharaja Ranjit Singh combined all different groups of the Sikhs and created the Khalsa kingdom. From 1779 to 1839, during the 40 years of Maharaja Ranjit Singh's rule, Sikhs were basically ruling over Punjab. And when Maharaja Ranjit Singh died in 1839, then Britishers had, started laying their eyes on the Punjab. So they had two battles fought against the Sikhs in 1845 and 1849. After the second battle, Anglo-Sikh War, they annexed Punjab to the British India. So they knew the fierceness of the Sikh soldiers who fought against the British Empire, British soldiers. So they basically, preferred their bravery and so on. So basically, they treated them as a martial race, and British Empire basically included Sikhs in British India as part of the army. So they were given preference. as a martial race. And as a result of that, Sikh tradition also started a farming tradition, Singh Saw movement in 1873. And basically, Sikhs were working in collaboration with the British, and they were redefining Sikh tradition in the colonial context, and explaining Sikhism like enlightenment movement and so on. So, Sikhism came to be redefined by the reform movement, by the Singh Sabha movement. And during the British rule, Sikhs were basically enjoying a preferential treatment, but at the same time, there were voices of the other movement started in USA. They wanted to liberate India from the British Empire, so they started the independent movement, and then Sikhs also started a Kali movement, and they also started their agitation in 1920. For 5 years, they were having non-violent agitation against the British Empire, and ultimately British, gave in, and they established independent sort of Sikh Gurdwara Act for the Sikhs, and Sikhs basically took control of all the Sikh shrine, and they became the democratic tradition of the British Empire.
And how about when India gained independence and there was the break into the Pakistans and India? The Punjab was split in half, and I heard there was migration back and forth across the line. How did that affect the people culturally, but also religiously? Did it have an effect, Pashara?
Culturally, religiously, Sikh community suffered a lot. 1.5 million Sikhs had to move from West Pakistan to East Pakistan. And in that experience, more than 1 million lives were lost. 100,000 women were raped and killed and so on. So that was a horrible experience for the Sikhs because they lost their Punjab. Punjab itself was divided into West Punjab and East Punjab. Now Punjab is a very small state. Sikhs ruled all over the Punjab, The Britishers did not give to the Sikhs, their original Punjab that they had taken over. So that's the resentment against the British Empire, that they did not treat the Sikhs well at the final moment, So after that, Sikhs had to struggle for independence of Punjab, independence Punjabi state in 1966. Punjab was created, further divided into Haryana, Himachal Pradesh, and Punjab. So now it's a very small state, but they are now majority in that state.
Yeah.
But
Lou, okay. Yeah. Lou, we can hear you again. Go ahead if you have a point to make.
No,
Okay, we lost you again, Lou.
That point came in 1984 when Prime Minister Indira Gandhi gave the orders of Indian Army to attack the Golden Temple. That was a recent turning point in our lives.
Okay.
It was a fierce, action taken by miscalculations of the central government of India, and now we are still struggling to resolve that issue. Sikhs are still, fighting for justice, and in that century, basically more than 80,000 up to 100,000 Sikhs lost their lives.
Okay.
That 50 years, it's a terrible period in modern Sikhism.
Well, let me just sort of wrap it up. Luke, let me see if I can just ask you for any final thoughts here as we are in the 21st century. If we can't, if you just keep going in and out, we'll just leave the final word to Peshawar then. But Luke, can you attempt to sum up anything here?
well, being said in that regard, Sikhism is extraordinarily progressive, and Sikhs have entered all walks of life all over the world today. And, I admire, especially now, especially post the horrific events of the 11th of September 2001. In the United States, to wear a turban marks you as a target. But the influence of the Sikh gurus, the themes of courage that permeate that tradition, really become manifest in so many of the Sikhs today. And they're so, dedicated to their symbols that despite the fact that they target them by certain groups in the United States, they nevertheless continue to wear them, and rightfully so. Okay?
Well,
And so that's
okay.
certainly something to admire that aligns so well with American values as well. Okay, and so that's my last word.
Well, thank you, Lou. I want to give the last word to Peshawar, but before I do, since he mentioned the turban and we talked about hair cutting, is one of the reasons that a turban is worn, is that because you have long hair, Peshawar, and that keeps it up?
Yeah, turban is the crown of the dress, for the Sikhs.
Uh-huh.
So if you touch this turban or at the security, at airports, they try to pat the turban and so on. So we go through that process. We feel it sort of humiliating experience. So turban is the crown of the dress. So basically, Sikhs, have a long history of persecution, even in recent times, 1984 and 2001, after 9/11, Lou has mentioned, first person who lost his life as a racial backlash was a Sikh, Mr. Sodhi, who was killed by a patriot. So again, on 5th August 2012, we know the Oak Creek Gurdwara tragedy. A white supremacist, entered into the Gurdwara, started shooting. So we lost 6 people, and so that experience has given Sikhs, this sort of feeling that we are being attacked for mistaken identity all the time. So more than 700 to 800, cases of racial backlash has been reported. So Sikhs have created Sikh activist organizations, Sikh Coalition, SELDF, and Sikhs for Justice, and so a number of organizations have come up to fight against racial discrimination or hate crimes. So we are doing that. But at the same time, Sikhs have also politically become so mature. In Canada, for example, in the federal government, you have now 4 Sikh ministers in Trudeau's cabinet. Even the defense minister is a Sikh, Harjit Singh Sajjan. So you have a very progressive community that follows the teachings of the gurus, and they are always standing for truth and justice. If you ask me what are the basic values, the Sikhs stand for divine unity, human equality, and social justice, and selfless service. So through service, they have, made their mark, and they have created voluntary organization. And as a progressive diaspora community in California, for example, you have more than 200,000 Sikhs in California, 500,000 Sikhs in USA alone, and more than 500,000 in Canada. And the same number will be in the UK. So you have about 2 million Sikhs in the diaspora, but 25 million Sikhs are all over the world. About 20 million Sikhs live in the state of Punjab, still the majority state in India. And then you have Sikhs spread in other parts of India as well. So out of 25 million Sikhs, the 2 million who are spread all over the world, they are basically doing really well. It's a progressive diaspora, and they are following the teachings of the gurus. It's a very lively tradition, very practical. Always, if you look at, a professor of religious studies, Diana said, Sikhs share 3 American values: the importance of hard work, a commitment to human equality, and the practice of neighborly hospitality. So these are 3 American values that are shared by the Sikhs. So Sikh values are not against American values or Canadian values. They are basically the same values that are being practiced by all over the world.
Well, I want to thank both you and Lou Fennick. I will link to both of your college, university pages. Anyone can contact you there. So thank you for spending over an hour speaking, both of you. Thank you very much.
My pleasure.
Yeah, thank you so much.